Bahrain is a small country, 11 miles wide at its narrowest point, 33 islands in the Persian Gulf, most of them uninhabited. The entire archipelago smaller than the city limits of Los Angeles. You could drive across it in 20 minutes on a good day. You could miss it entirely on a map if your finger moved too fast. But what happened to a specific industrial complex on that small island in the early hours of this morning is not a small story. It is not a regional story. It is not even primarily a military story. What happened this morning in Bahrain is an economic story of a scale and a specificity that the IRGC chose deliberately, calculated precisely, and executed with a targeting logic so sophisticated that it tells you more about Iranian strategic thinking than any press release, any diplomatic communique, or any statement from any government currently involved in this conflict ever could. The aluminum Bahrain complex, known across global commodity markets simply as ALBA, is the fifth largest aluminum smelter on Earth. It processes roughly 1 million metric tons of aluminum per year. It supplies aerospace manufacturers, automotive producers, packaging companies, and construction firms across 4 continents. It is the single largest industrial employer in Bahrain, the largest non-oil revenue generator in the country's economy, and one of the critical nodes in the global aluminum supply chain that every industry dependent on lightweight metal relies on, for materials that go into everything from the aircraft you fly in to the can your beverage comes in to the frame of the laptop or the phone you're watching this on right now. The IRGC did not hit a military base this morning. It hit the global supply chain. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that choice, that specific target at this specific moment, represents the most strategically sophisticated escalation decision Iran has made in this entire conflict. What it means for your wallet, your investments, your supply chains, and a global economy already running on borrowed time and borrowed money to the tune of 39 trillion American dollars. Stay with me, because this morning changed something permanent, something that cannot be rebuilt in weeks or months. And what it changed will be visible in your life in ways that most people will not connect to a small island in the Persian Gulf until it is far too late to position for it. Start with what ALBA actually is, because the name Aluminum Bahrain does not capture the strategic weight of what was destroyed this morning. And you need to understand that weight before you can understand why the IRGC chose it above every other possible target in the region. ALBA was established in 1971 and has been expanded 6 times since. Each expansion making it larger, more productive, and more deeply integrated into the global supply chains depending on its output. The 6th expansion, completed in 2019, pushed annual production capacity past 1 million metric tons and made ALBA one of the most efficient large-scale alumina smelters operating anywhere on Earth. Efficiency matters in aluminum production because aluminum smelting is extraordinarily energy-intensive. The process of converting aluminina into aluminum metal through electrolytic reduction requires enormous and continuous electricity, because the electrolytic cells performing the reduction cannot be switched off and back on without causing damage that takes months and billions in capital to repair. ALBA runs on dedicated power generation. It has its own power plant. It has supply chain infrastructure connecting it to global shipping through the port of Khalifa bin Salman. It has a workforce of thousands and a customer network extending to every major industrial economy on Earth. Hitting ALBA is not hitting a building. It is hitting a node in a global system. And hitting a node in a global system with the precision the IRGC demonstrated this morning sends a message to every other node in every other system that Iranian targeting logic has now expanded beyond military installations into the industrial and economic infrastructure of American partner countries in ways this conflict had not previously reached. That expansion of targeting logic is the most important strategic development of this entire conflict. More important than any single missile, more important than any base closure, more important than any naval engagement, because it tells you what Iran has decided the rules of this conflict now are. And those rules do not have a boundary that any government currently involved was prepared to enforce. Here is the targeting logic in its full strategic depth, because this is where the Iranian decision becomes visible in its sophistication and where most coverage will miss the most important element of what happened. The IRGC did not choose ALBA randomly. It chose it because of what ALBA represents across 3 overlapping strategic dimensions that together explain why the specific target at this specific moment was worth the enormous escalation cost of striking directly at the industrial heart of a country hosting the United States Fifth Fleet. The first dimension is economic signal. Aluminum is not oil. It is not a commodity. The world has spent decades building strategic reserves and alternative supply chains to protect against disruption. It is a commodity the global manufacturing system has assumed will be available at scale continuously from a small number of very large production facilities because the economics of aluminum smelting makes small distributed production economically unviable. When you remove 1 million metric tons of annual production capacity from the global supply picture, you do not create a shortage that resolves in weeks through market adjustment. You create a structural gap that takes years to fill because building replacement smelting capacity at Alba's scale requires billions in capital investment, years of construction timelines, and reliable energy supply that is not available on short notice. Anywhere that new capacity might theoretically be built, the IRGC chose a target whose damage cannot be quickly reversed. The irreversibility is the message. The second dimension is alliance targeting. Bahrain is not a peripheral American partner. It is the host country of the United States Fifth Fleet, the naval command responsible for American military operations across the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and large portions of the Indian Ocean. American naval forces operating from Bahrain have anchored every American military operation in the Gulf for 3 decades. Striking a major Bahraini industrial facility is a decision to impose severe economic costs on the country hosting the most important American naval command in the region. It signals to the Bahraini government and through Bahrain to every Gulf state hosting American forces that the protection provided by American military presence carries a cost Iran has demonstrated willingness to impose regardless of whether the target is military or civilian industrial infrastructure. That signal crosses a threshold Gulf state governments had been watching with particular attention throughout this conflict. The threshold between Iranian military action against American forces and Iranian economic action against the countries hosting them. The IRGC crossed it this morning, and the governments in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Kuwait City are processing that crossing with an urgency their public statements will not reflect but that their private security planning will incorporate immediately. The third dimension is commodity market leverage. Aluminum is in everything. It is in the aircraft moving people and goods across the global economy. It is in the vehicles moving people and goods within every major economy. It is in the packaging preserving food and beverages and pharmaceuticals across supply chains spanning continents. It is in the construction materials going into every major building project in every economy trying to grow its way out of the inflation and debt problems preceding this conflict. It is in the electrical grid infrastructure every economy needs to expand to support the energy transition governments worldwide have committed to. Removing 1 million metric tons of annual production capacity from the global supply picture is not a commodity market disruption. It is a manufacturing economy disruption that compounds through supply chains in ways showing up in prices, production delays, and investment decisions across every sector depending on the disrupted input. The aluminum price moved this morning with the violence of a market absorbing a structural supply shock rather than a temporary one. Not a spike that traders buy as a dip and sell as the situation normalizes. A repricing, a fundamental reassessment of the global supply picture for one of the most widely used industrial metals on Earth happening simultaneously with elevated oil prices, Hormuz uncertainty, and the sovereign debt pressures that $39 trillion American dollars of borrowing generates in treasury markets. The convergence of those signals in a single morning is something the models managing global supply chain risk were not designed to process simultaneously. When models fail, the human decision-making replacing them tends to be more conservative, more defensive, and more economically costly. Companies needing aluminum will build inventory buffers they would not have built before this morning. Those buffers require capital not going into investment or production. That reduction in productive investment compounds the economic slowdown that high energy prices and high interest rates were already generating. That compounding slowdown reduces tax revenues across every affected economy. Reduced tax revenues on top of existing deficit spending adds to debt loads already at levels markets are beginning to price as risks rather than assumptions. The chain of consequence running from an IRGC missile hitting an aluminum smelter in Bahrain to the fiscal condition of governments on 4 continents is not theoretical. It is arithmetic. And this morning's arithmetic is not moving in a direction that anyone holding sovereign debt, corporate bonds, or equity in any sector dependent on manufactured goods wants to examine closely. The construction sector dimension of the Alba strike is one that almost no analyst discussing this morning's events is covering. And yet, it may be the most immediately felt consequence in the economies of developing nations watching this conflict from a distance. Aluminum is a foundational construction material across the infrastructure programs that middle-income countries from Southeast Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America have committed to as part of their economic development strategies. Window systems, structural frameworks, roofing panels, electrical conduit, transportation infrastructure components. All of these demand aluminum at a scale that supply disruptions translate directly into project delays, cost overruns, and the kind of infrastructure bottlenecks that slow economic growth in economies already managing the pressure of high energy costs and elevated borrowing rates. When developing country governments discover that the aluminum they need for hospitals, schools, power plants, and roads is either unavailable at previous prices or simply unavailable, the political consequences are immediate in ways that commodity market disruption models do not fully capture. This morning's strike on Alba is being felt by a construction foreman in Vietnam, a government infrastructure planner in Kenya, and a housing developer in Brazil as surely as it is being felt by aerospace procurement officers in Seattle and automotive supply chain managers in Stuttgart. The aerospace dimension is particularly significant and under-reported. Commercial aircraft manufacturing has been struggling with supply chain constraints limiting production rates at both Boeing and Airbus for years. Aluminum is a primary structural material in every commercial aircraft currently in production. Production rate increases that both manufacturers have been planning. Increases airlines have counted on to replace aging fleets and expand capacity to meet growing passenger demand depend on reliable aluminum supply at scale and predictable cost. An Alba strike removing 1 million metric tons of annual capacity and raising aluminum prices to levels potentially persisting for years is not only a commodity market story. It is an aerospace manufacturing story. It is an airline economic story. It is a story about whether the commercial aviation recovery that has been one of the few genuine bright spots in a global economy otherwise defined by inflation and debt stress continues or stalls. At the moment, supply chain constraints might otherwise have begun easing. The automotive dimension is equally significant. The transition from internal combustion vehicles to electric vehicles has dramatically increased aluminum content per vehicle because electric vehicle battery enclosures, structural components protecting heavy battery packs, and thermal weight management systems all require aluminum at scales. Traditional vehicle manufacturing did not. Every major automotive manufacturer has made supply chain commitments based on aluminum availability assumptions. This morning's strike has now disrupted. The disruption does not stop electric vehicle production immediately, but it raises production costs, extends supply chain lead times, and creates procurement uncertainty, causing manufacturers to reduce production guidance in ways affecting employment, investment, and the broader economic activity. Vehicle manufacturing generates across hundreds of supplier companies in dozens of countries. Now, let us talk about China's reaction to this morning. Because Beijing's response to the Alba strike is the variable that almost no Western analysis is tracking, and that may ultimately matter more than any military response the Fifth Fleet can generate. China is the world's single largest consumer of aluminum, Chinese manufacturing, Chinese construction, Chinese infrastructure development, Chinese electric vehicle production. All of these sectors require aluminum at a scale that makes China uniquely sensitive to any disruption in global aluminum supply. But China is also the country that has spent the last decade positioning itself as the alternative security and economic anchor for the Gulf states, watching American deterrence credibility erode in real time. The Alba strike puts Beijing in a strategically favorable position it did not have to engineer. Gulf state governments updating their security calculations after watching Iran strike Alba, while the Fifth Fleet sat in Bahrain, are governments making calls to Beijing that they would not have made 6 months ago. China does not need to say anything about the Alba strike. It does not need to issue statements or take positions. All it needs to do is be available, helpful, willing to discuss alternative arrangements. And the governments calling Beijing this morning are finding exactly that availability waiting for them on the other end of the line. Now let us talk about the Fifth Fleet and what the American military response actually needs to achieve. Because the response to a strike on Bahraini civilian industrial infrastructure from the country hosting the Fifth Fleet is not a simple tactical decision. It is a strategic decision with implications extending far beyond the immediate military exchange. The Fifth Fleet has the capability to respond with devastating force against Iranian naval assets in the Gulf. That capability has existed throughout this conflict and has been deliberately held in reserve as part of the calibrated escalation management characterizing American military decision-making since the first Iranian proxy attacks began. The question is not whether the Fifth Fleet can respond. The question is what a response achieves strategically at this specific moment. A maximum response achieves the immediate objective of punishing the attack and demonstrating that striking Bahraini industrial targets carries military consequences, but it does not address the underlying strategic logic of the IRGC's targeting decision. It does not undo the economic damage to Alba. It does not reverse the signal sent to every Gulf state government about the cost of hosting American forces. A restrained response has the opposite problem. In the strategic environment created by the IRGC striking civilian industrial infrastructure in a country hosting American naval forces, restraint that looks like hesitation signals that the protection offered by American military presence has a limit that has just been discovered. That signal lands in every Gulf state capital with the same force as the original strike. The response American strategic planners will most seriously consider is something between those poles. Targeted demonstrative strikes against Iranian assets directly associated with the attack calibrated to impose cost without triggering full escalation. The challenge is that calibration requires the adversary to read it as intended. And the Iranian factions authorizing this morning's strike have demonstrated throughout this conflict that they interpret American calibration as confirmation that America is operating within self-imposed limits that can be probed further. Here is what the Saudi response to this morning means and why it is the most consequential allied reaction of any government not directly party to the immediate exchange. Saudi Arabia has been watching the erosion of the American security guarantee with the calculating attention of a government that has made security decisions for 60 years based on the assumption that American power in the region was reliable enough to anchor its most important bets. The Alba strike changes the Saudi calculation in a specific way. Previous Iranian actions did not because the target was not military. It was economic. It was the industrial infrastructure of a neighboring Gulf state as close to Saudi Arabia in political and security alignment as any country in the region. The fact that the Fifth Fleet base on that neighboring state's territory did not prevent the strike is a Saudi data point of the first order. Saudi Arabia has SABIC, one of the largest petrochemical companies on earth. Saudi Arabia has Aramco facilities among the most critical energy infrastructure assets in the world. Saudi Arabia has been assuming those assets are protected by a deterrence umbrella, making an IRGC strike prohibitively costly. The Alba strike raises the question of whether that assumption remains valid. When Saudi Arabia asks that question seriously, the answer will shape every major Saudi economic and security decision for the next decade. The calls to Beijing that were previously exploratory are becoming more substantive. The decisions about oil production that were previously calibrated to balance American economic preferences with Saudi national interests are being recalibrated in ways reflecting a Saudi judgment that the American preference is no longer the only anchor that matters. Here is the connection to the $39 trillion problem, completing the strategic picture of what the IRGC accomplished this morning. American fiscal sustainability depends on economic growth. Growth generates tax revenues. Revenues reduce the gap between what the government spends and what it collects. A smaller gap means less borrowing. Less borrowing means less pressure on the debt load. Less pressure on the debt means less pressure on treasury yields. Lower yields mean lower interest payments on the existing $39 trillion. Lower interest payments mean more fiscal room for everything else the government needs to fund. That cycle is the only realistic path to American fiscal sustainability, not involving dramatic spending cuts or dramatic tax increases, both of which are politically impossible in the current environment. Economic growth is the key variable, and the combination of oil above $130, a disrupted aluminum supply chain, an aerospace sector facing input cost increases, an automotive sector facing supply uncertainty, a construction sector in developing markets facing material shortages, a logistics system absorbing multiple simultaneous cost shocks, and an investment environment in which capital is increasingly defensive rather than productive is a combination that does not produce the growth American fiscal sustainability requires. It produces the conditions in which the debt load grows faster than the economy can service it, in which the interest payment already at $1 trillion a year grows further, in which the gap between American fiscal reality and American strategic ambition becomes visible to the foreign holders of American debt in ways that change their behavior and make the gap larger still. Here is what needs to happen in the next 72 hours for this situation to remain within the boundaries of something manageable. First, the American military response must be calibrated with strategic precision. The domestic political environment makes extraordinarily difficult. Too much triggers an escalation cycle extending the conflict into domains and timelines the fiscal constraint cannot support. Too little confirms the signal the Alba strike was designed to send about the limits of American deterrence. Second, the economic response needs to address the supply chain disruption with speed and scale, demonstrating resilience of the broader system even when a specific node is damaged. Strategic aluminum reserve releases. Emergency procurement coordination among allied countries with available production capacity. Accelerated permitting for production increases at facilities outside the conflict zone. These are the actions preventing a commodity market disruption from becoming a manufacturing economy. Disruption compounding into the fiscal crisis. The underlying debt situation is already creating pressure toward. Third, the diplomatic architecture that recent public statements appeared to close must be quietly reconstructed through whatever intermediary channel remains viable, because the Alba strike is evidence of something every serious analysis of this conflict has been pointing toward for weeks. The escalation path existing without a diplomatic framework does not have a stable endpoint serving American interests, allied interests, or the interests of the global economy depending on stability in this region. Alba is not the last target on the IRGC's list. It is the latest target, and the logic selecting it has more targets available than the current American military posture can simultaneously protect. Watch the aluminum price over the next 72 hours. If it stabilizes at elevated levels, it signals markets believe the supply disruption is real but contained. If it continues to move higher, it signals markets are pricing additional IRGC strikes against Gulf industrial infrastructure as a continuing feature of the strategic environment rather than a one-time shock. The difference between those two signals is the difference between a disruption and a structural change. And a structural change in the security environment for Gulf industrial infrastructure is a structural change in the cost of everything that infrastructure produces. Watch the Fifth Fleet posture. Operational movements of American naval assets in the Gulf will tell you more about American strategic intentions than any official statement. Watch Bahrain itself. The Bahraini government's response, the statements it makes, the security decisions it visibly takes will tell you whether the alliance architecture is holding under the strain of the first direct IRGC strike against a Gulf state's civilian industrial infrastructure. A Bahraini government maintaining its public's posture of confidence in the American alliance while privately demanding more is a government that is holding. A Bahraini government beginning to hedge its position, reaching out to intermediaries, reconsidering force hosting arrangements that would have been unthinkable before this morning, is a government telling you the alliance architecture is fracturing in ways the public statements are designed to conceal. The IRGC obliterated Bahrain's strategic aluminum hub this morning. It did not do so because aluminum is a military target. It did so because aluminum is an economic target. Because attacking it sends a message about Iranian targeting logic that extends to every piece of economic infrastructure in every American partner country in the region. Because the supply chain consequences reach into the manufacturing economies of allies on 4 continents in ways military strikes against military targets cannot achieve. And because doing it now in the specific fiscal and diplomatic environment maximizes strategic impact relative to escalation cost in a way reflecting 30 years of accumulated Iranian experience finding the leverage points that American strategic planning underestimates until the moment they are exploited. The world is made of aluminum and oil and debt and deterrence. And this morning, on a small island most people had never thought about, the IRGC demonstrated it understands the architecture of that world better than the people who built it were prepared for. The next move is being calculated right now in Tehran, in Washington, in Riyadh, and in the trading rooms where the price of aluminum and oil and American government bonds is being set by markets. Doing the most honest accounting of where this story is going that exists anywhere in the world. Listen to those prices because they are telling you something. No government on any side of this conflict is currently willing to say out loud. The cost is compounding. The tools available to stop the compounding are fewer than they were yesterday. And the small island in the Persian Gulf that you had never heard of is now the place where the global economy learned that no industrial asset, no economic node, no partner country's infrastructure is beyond the reach of a conflict that nobody has yet found the framework to end. Stay with the story because the world you wake up to tomorrow is already different from the one you knew yesterday. The next chapter is being written, and the aluminum that goes into everything you own is the first line of